our contact with Professor Parmar, the Centro de Serviço e Carreiras and the Centro de Produção of the Social Sciences Institute that helped us to organize the details of this meeting. I wish you all a very pleasant debate. Thank you.
Neste momento, a mesa de abertura se desfaz. Agradecemos a presença da professora Tânia, que ocupará seu lugar reservado nesse auditório. Pedimos à professora Daniela que permaneça no palco, pois conduzirá os trabalhos da próxima mesa. Daremos início à aula inaugural do curso de Relações Internacionais da PUC Minas Praça da Liberdade, com o tema Policrise ou Crise Orgânica? A crise dos Estados Unidos e da ordem mundial liderada por eles. Informamos que após a apresentação do convidado, teremos um momento de perguntas. Convidamos para compor a mesa de trabalho o palestrante convidado, professor Parmar. Passo a palavra à coordenadora do curso de Relações Internacionais da Unidade Praça da Liberdade, professora doutora Daniela Vieira Sex, que a partir de agora coordenará os trabalhos. Professora, fique à vontade para iniciar sua fala. Obrigada.
Thank you, Bruna. So I will introduce Professor Parmar. Some of you have already read him in our International Ethics course. All of you will for sure at some point read him. And we are very glad to have you here, Professor. Professor Inderjeet Parmar reads sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Sociology at the University of London. His doctorate from the University of Manchester was in the fields of political science and international relations. Prior to appointment at City University of London in 2012, he taught at the University of Manchester from 1991 to 2012, mainly in its Department of Government, which between 2006-09, he served as head of department. His work is focused on US foreign policy, theories on global politics, and foreign policy analysis. Please, Professor Parmar, the floor is yours from wherever you prefer to talk, right?
Yeah, so I was just thanking everyone for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here to share some ideas and to also develop ideas, because once somebody gets an invitation, then it's incumbent on that person to have a good think about what's happened in the world, what is more recent, and then try to make some kind of sense of it in the historical context, but also in regard to ways of thinking about and explaining ways in which the world is working. So the title of my talk today is Polycrisis or Organic Crisis, the Crisis of the United States and the US-led World Order. And US students of international relations and so on are interested in the world and how it works. It won't be a surprise to you that when you look around, you read anything, you go into any news website or a news program, or open a newspaper, or look at Twitter or any other social media platform, that today the kind of news reporting and discussions are all around words like crisis, disorder, chaos, the end of a rules-based order, decline of the West, the rise of the rest, systemic or strategic rivalries, existential threats from China, sometimes from climate change, from pandemics, even from nuclear warfare. And people say there are existential and other threats from Russia, as well as a kind of return of a new Cold War and the return of geopolitics. That is to say, we live in what looks increasingly like and is thought about increasingly like an age of disorder and of crisis. And in this sort of age of disorder and crisis, which I think there is enough there as a reality, an objective reality, the United States is a world pivotal state. It may not be exceptional in the way in which many American elites consider their nations and their role in the world, but it is extraordinary given the amount of power that it exercises in a number of different domains in the world. It's a superpower, but it's no longer alone. And that is to say that the world is much more crowded with more voices, more ideas, more assertions and so on, and more assertions of power than it has been in many, many decades. So the key thing, I think, is that the United States may be less significant in the world compared with before because of the rise of other powers, but it remains nevertheless central to any kind of analysis of the crisis of world order and world affairs. It is the most comprehensive power that exists in the world today in terms of economic, financial, military, diplomatic, cultural and ideological, as well as it's a knowledge superpower in terms of the production, the sheer value, the quantity and reach of its knowledge power itself. And at the center of this great comprehensive power is, if you like, a relatively small set of people, which I would refer to here as the American foreign policy establishment. And that this American foreign policy establishment is a distillation of several elites, military, academic, diplomatic, corporate, think tank, foundation, and other media, and so on. It's a distillation of all the key elites that hold the levers of power in that society. So at the center of American power is this American foreign policy establishment. And in a way, it is a perfect embodiment of what Antonio Gramsci referred to as a hegemony, or as a hegemonic bloc. That is, it embodies both tremendous coercive power, military, war-making, and economic and financial power, but it also wields a great deal of consensual power, or persuasive power, what some people call cultural, and Joseph Nye has called soft power. But in combination, it makes the United States very different from other countries in the world and state and powers in the world today. And what happens in the United States still continues to impact the world, and what happens in the world impacts greatly the United States itself. And that is because the United States is embedded in and is an architect of and a manager of the international system. So a crisis of the United States and of world order is really also a crisis of this American foreign policy establishment. So I want to do four things in today's remarks. The first thing I'd like to do is to provide an outline of the aspects of the crisis and change in the world and in the United States. Secondly, I want to look at three ways in which we might think about the nature of the world crisis and the crisis of American power. And I'm going to talk very briefly about polycrisis as a kind of liberal order theorizing, organic crisis as a Gramscian idea, and another view, which is a bit more metaphorical, which may be called a singularity, which derives from mathematical formula and knowledge. The third thing I would like to do is to provide some empirical and historical and political details of American power and its journey to the position that it finds itself in today at home and abroad. And finally, draw some conclusions and make some speculations about where the United States is heading and where the world may also be heading in the next few years or so. So, as you know, the level of complexity in the world, the number of powers and forces which are acting in the world today is probably greater and more significant than has been the case as far as I can recall reading and living through. That is to say, the complexity, the sheer amount of empirical knowledge anyone needs in order to understand actually what is going on in the world is too vast for one person alone. This makes the situation quite difficult for scholars because it means that there are far more questions and then there may be answers, just because the sheer complexity of the situation is so great. As I say, this is very interesting for scholarship, but it's very disturbing and causes a great deal of anxiety for us as human beings who are living in the world and try to navigate our way through the realities of the way in which the world is going and the dangers which are appearing, which have already appeared in many countries and parts of the world already. So internationally, there are, as you know, long-term power shifts, a changing global distribution of power and of status and of economic influence, but also a kind of psychological revolution, a revolution in levels of confidence. The distribution of confidence in world affairs has shifted from the West to the South and other powers, as has the rise of resentment as a global force. And this is a kind of resentment felt in post-colonial and global South regions and states about the way in which the last 500 years have actually gone, in the way in which colonialism and so on has impacted their lives and their countries' economies, development, and so on and so forth. And this resentment is felt in world politics today because those global South powers, many global South powers today, have the ability and the willingness to assert themselves. And this is when the resentment and nationalism and other forces come more closely to the fore. The key thing, of course, is that we all know that these power shifts are going on. We all know that there's a lot of movement and flux. I think the big problem is knowing how fundamental are these power shifts. Are these power shifts durable? Are they going to last a long time, or are they fleeting and likely to be over? World history is rarely linear in a gradual process on a kind of a sort of a linear line on a graph. It often has zigzags and setbacks and so on, and crises, etc. as well. So we don't know how permanent or durable these shifts might be. Are these shifts and changes, are they existential threats to the United States order, or are these just indicating a greater level of intensity of competition and rivalry within the system that the United States has established? Because many of the global South powers, if not all of them, are actually doing very well, largely as a result of the fact of that US-led system being the kind of context within which their economic, financial, trading, and other powers have increased. Is there really a new Cold War which is developing? And would Asia agree that this is a new Cold War? Because many in Asia would argue that the old Cold War has never ended for them. That is, the old Cold War continues to have its impact on the way in which they live their lives in that part of the world as well, that the Cold War was particularly bloody and there was no long peace as far as they were concerned. Now, the Ukraine war in the last 1 year or more has thrown a lot of tendencies into very sharp relief. Western unity has increased as a result of the outbreak, the Russian aggression in Ukraine. But how long-lasting is that? How durable or stable is that? And we have seen many movements for autonomy, strategic autonomy from France and from Germany and other powers as well, and a weakening of public opinion within Western countries in regard to the Ukraine war and the arming of the Ukrainian forces there as well. We have also seen a kind of a global South alienation from the kind of a sanctions regime which the United States and its allies have established, a kind of realignment of many global South powers with Russia, with China, or both. And we see that practically every day. Just in the last 2 weeks, Beijing has brokered an approachment between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which nobody thought possible and which has completely blindsided the United States diplomatically as well. And there are many other kind of dislocations which are going on in regard to the global South and to the West. So what we've got is a great deal of change, but at the same time, as this kind of pulling away from one another, there is also the kind of key fact of globalization and the globalization of world economy, world finance, world investment, and trade flows, etc. For many people, globalization was a source of interdependence, which would guarantee a degree of stability and order and kind of a peaceful competition. But on the other hand, many people have seen also that globalization is not a kind of perfect process, that nationalism continues to play a very major role. And we saw in the pandemic, the global pandemic, COVID-19, how vaccine nationalism and medical nationalism played major roles in the way in which the distribution of pharmaceutical and drug power played a key role in the hoarding of vaccines and so on in the global north. So people nowadays talk about deglobalization, that there is a degree to which the world is deglobalizing. And what do we know about that? And how long is that process going to last? And what impacts will that have on the way in which world sort of power distributions take place? The other thing, of course, is important is that, as I mentioned before, that many of these countries from the global south, China, India, Brazil, and many others, have grown up to become where they are economically and diplomatically in this American-led world order. And their economies and currencies and so on have become interpenetrated with one another, not just interdependent, but interpenetrated, such that it is very difficult to have a crisis in one country alone, and that crisis not to spread into many, many other countries, which is to say that China, and for all the issues about a Cold War, a new Cold War, China is so deeply integrated into Western economies that that interpenetration means that you cannot just separate out these particular kinds of powers without massive kind of global repercussions as well. So interpenetration of economies and of their economic elites is a very important factor I think we have to bear in mind. So just as an outline, that is the kind of range of ideas and problems and questions which arise as a result of international power shifts that are going on. Domestically in the United States and in other countries as well, and you've seen in Brazil, in your own country in the last couple of months, that there is a crisis of democracy itself. And this crisis of democracy is not limited to the United States. It is far more widespread. And this crisis of democracy is also a kind of a fear of civil war, that there is a degree of polarization and factionalization within the body politic of the United States and some other countries as well, which has created a sort of crisis of legitimacy, a crisis of democracy, and a fear of civil war. In a very recent book by Barbara Walter called How Civil Wars Start, she has applied her knowledge of civil wars and the stages they go through to get to civil war in Africa, Latin America, and in Asia, and applied it to the United States. And her argument is that the United States on the 6th of January 2021 was on the brink of a civil war, and that this threat of civil war and of factionalization, which she called factionalization, remains very, very important. So when we look at the midterm elections in November 2022, they did not resolve any big issue of American democracy within that particular country. Although the Democratic Party and President Biden's party did extremely well and bucked the historical trend in terms of not being defeated and actually only very marginally defeated in the House and retaining the Senate and so on, it nevertheless did not resolve the problem of the future of the political career of Donald Trump, nor of Trumpism without Donald Trump itself. This is to say that one half of the American political party system, the Republican Party, is no longer committed to free and fair elections in which they lose the election. That is, the grand old party, the Republican Party, is a European-style far-right political party in a system that only has two political parties to choose between. So it has this sort of deep-seated legitimacy crisis of the party establishment, which I'll talk about a little bit more. In addition to that, the continuation of deaths and hospitalizations around COVID-19 and the pandemic has reached well over 1 million. There's large mass-scale demand for an end to enduring wars or forever wars or permanent wars. There's large-scale opposition, mass uprisings against racist police violence, against rising inequality. There's the biggest strike wave by organized labor and unorganized labor as well in many, many decades. That is to say that the level of street protest, which has occurred recently in the United States, is broken beyond what it was in the 1960s. A survey by Princeton University showed that in 2020, in the wake of the killing by police of George Floyd, 17% of Americans had protested on the streets in that particular year, which is a higher proportion and certainly a higher number than they occurred in the 1960s. In the middle of all this, in these kind of big global changes and these kind of massive crises of democracy and power and the contestation of the establishment inside the United States, we have President Joseph Biden. And people would ask the question, is there such a thing as Bidenism, which might look at and resolve some of these global issues and some of these domestic issues. That is to say, can the United States, does the United States have the authority and leadership and the ideas and the imagination to actually come up with a grand bargain, a new grand bargain, which will resolve some of the problems of American democracy and inequality at home, but also link up with how that might fit with a new kind of global order, which recognizes the reality, the objective reality, it would appear to be, of the growing kind of character of multipolarity as a description of the way in which the world works. Many people are very pessimistic on this particular question, but I would think that there are some moves made by the Biden administration in that kind of a direction. That is, there is a movement among certain kind of more far-sighted, thoughtful forces towards post-neoliberalism for domestic renewal and stability. In that context, the Democratic Party talks about a foreign policy for the working class, a foreign policy with an industrial policy at its heart, an infrastructure policy worth $1 trillion at its heart to create more higher paying jobs in order, in effect, to sort of renew American domestic strength and stability in order to be able to launch a new global offensive. So on the one hand, you've got the development of what Trump called America first, but which Biden is far more quiet and more sober, and it has a very different kind of style, but it remains a very US-centered policy of increasing domestic economic, political, and financial strength in order, A, to renew, B, to stabilize, but also to engage in far stronger competition with what they see as the Chinese threat. They are also talking about the consolidation or the reconsolidation of a democratic bloc as opposed to the autocratic powers and so on as well. But I would ask some questions about the Biden policy, and that is, at home, Biden does not appear, or his administration does not appear to be a reliable ally against the extreme right or even the fascistic elements of the Republican Party. Donald Trump has not been taken to court for the most serious offenses, which he is being investigated for, which is the 6th January coup and insurrection attempt, and also the attempt to, in effect, steal the election in Georgia state in that year as well. In addition to that, we have the Ukraine war crisis, in which the United States is spending billions of dollars diverting funds to that particular war, at the same time as the United States people themselves have very poor economic and other conditions. And the other thing about the Ukraine crisis for Biden himself, of course, is his son is very deeply implicated in Ukraine domestic politics too, through his the fact that he used the good offices of the Vice President Biden in order to get a very high position in an energy corporation in the Ukraine when his father was the Vice President. So what we have here, if you like, is a great deal of turmoil at home and abroad. And we have a domestic administration which is still kind of, if you like, beleaguered by very right-wing forces, which it is unwilling or maybe even incapable of adequately taking on. And this means that the situation in the United States remains very volatile, very unstable, and it makes the United States, if you like, an unreliable ally. And it sends a signal to many other powers, including its allies, that you cannot rely on the United States to stand with you should any further crises come. And as a result of that, that liberal order, at the center of which is the United States, has loosened, is unraveling from within, because the United States as the architect of that order, and Britain, which was its junior partner in the construction of it, have more and more opted out of elements of that particular settlement built from 1945 onwards. So that means that, if you like, the world is in a period of hybridity, transition, or change, the direction of which is difficult to know, and hence these three concepts, which I'd like to now talk about, which may help us kind of frame or have a think about what might be ways to explain the kind of current crisis of the United States and of the world. So as I said, I will talk about organic crisis, polycrisis, and the so-called negative singularity. Now, nowadays, I'm going to talk about the organic crisis first, or the idea of the organic crisis. Nowadays, a lot of people who are not Marxist or Gramscian are quoting Antonio Gramsci's work because he wrote a great deal about crises of order and disorder and crises of hegemony and so on 100 years ago, when he was a free man, and then later on when he was imprisoned through his prison notebooks. In 2019, the Munich Security Conference report cited and quoted Antonio Gramsci on organic crisis. I'll just quote it directly. The quote from the Munich Security Conference, if you don't know it, it is not an organization of international Marxism. It's an organization of international Western powers designed to uphold their security, but look at the issues and challenges which their security largely faces. This is what it says. It says, quote, in his prison notebooks, the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci wrote, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. An apt description of today, they conclude. So what is an organic crisis? What Gramsci meant when he was talking about organic crisis is an organic crisis very different from a kind of a sort of conjunctural or crisis in one particular area in economy or polity or society. An organic crisis he considered to be a comprehensive crisis which encompasses the totality of a system or an order. And in that system or order, the ruling elites and ruling classes are no longer able to generate any consensus behind their material or their ideological or political ideas or plans. And what a crisis, like an organic crisis, really exposes is that this is a crisis of hegemony. It's a crisis all at once in the economy, in politics, in society, and ideology altogether. And that these crises of hegemony, that's a crisis of the ruling elites underneath that hegemony, means that the political parties, the established political parties, no longer have the sort of full support of the electorate and the citizens, that their economic policies no longer command a great deal of support, and nor do their value systems. On the other hand, Gramsci argued that even though you have this organic crisis, that is a system, if you like, which is tottering from within because it is unraveling from within, its kind of heart is being ripped out from it, the system doesn't necessarily collapse. It has a huge amount of resilience built in as well, protective layers, which are really important in periods of crisis. But these protective layers are not only seeking to reverse the crisis, a crisis, an organic crisis, is also, in his view, a moment of reconstruction. It's a moment of renewal as well. It's a moment when other ways of seeing the world, other ways of organizing the world, organizing power, also come to the fore. So the most kind of far-sighted history makers, as Gramsci would call them, those who live on the terrain of politics, economy, society as it is today, but also have a vision of what the future might look like, a reformed future might look like, are also very active in the world. That is to say, they're trying to renew, restabilize, reconstruct a new hegemony, which may have more inclusive elements of the population and of the world, society and state and so on within it, but which will also have elements of the past deeply embedded, including corporate power. So the key problem for Gramsci in regard to the organic crisis and this sort of renewal and reconstruction from an organic crisis is the problem is that this reconstruction is not always peaceful. This reconstruction is accompanied by large-scale conflict, domestic political violence, as well as international warfare and military violence as well. Now, this is complexified even further when we look at a concept called ultra-imperialism from the work of Karl Kautsky from about 100 years ago or so, where we see that the world as it is today, and particularly the sort of the rise of China to become the kind of power it is now in the world, that this world was partly assisted in becoming what it is by the United States itself, that the Chinese ruling class's integration into the world economy has occurred in a manner in which has made it kind of interpenetrated. It is interpenetrated with the Western economies and the American economy. It is competitive with those economies, but it also has strategic rivalries with those economies. this complexity means there is going to be a lot of turbulence and a lot of possibly violence in the transitional period. But it's not like the old Cold War. It is not necessarily an ideological competition. There is no Warsaw Pact against NATO. There is no kind of large numbers of political parties in the world which are allied with the Chinese Communist Party as they were with the Soviet Communist Party and so on. This is a very different kind of situation. And so we can see this in the reactions of the United States and, say, of Britain in regard to China. It is not a full-throated rejection like it was of the Soviet Union. That is an ideological ally who you have to roll back and destroy, in effect, because it is an existential threat. But you see this in the selective decoupling, which the United States is engaging from China. And in the British case, the policy of robust pragmatism. That is to say that China is a benefit and an opportunity, but it is also a threat. The decoupling of security from investment, finance, and trade, etc. And how can we come up with a formulation which might reflect what this so-called new reality might be? And it's a very difficult one, and I've come up with a very clumsy way, and I would call it a disarticulated transnational historic bloc. That is to say, it is not a perfect historic bloc. It has many significant rivalries, but it appears to be a transnational historic bloc with inarticulation or disarticulation in it, which has some special racial, ideological, and geopolitical features. And these special racial, ideological, and geopolitical features, if you like, constitute a source of danger in world politics today. But it may not be an existential danger, but certainly a period of danger, because very often great change comes along with a great deal of violence to the way in which the world used to work. So organic crisis, I would argue, points us towards this transitional moment, which is full of danger of political violence inside the United States and possibly therefore in other countries too, as well as in the international system. The second way I'd like to sort of suggest you might think about the American crisis in particular is this theory called the singularity. It's a very interesting concept. It's a mathematical concept, actually, but I think it may sum up to some extent the way in which what 2016 might represent in American politics and how it kind of develops from there. And because I believe we're still living in the kind of impact of 2016, and that is going to continue for some time. So this term, the singularity, refers to a dramatic statistical discontinuity. If you like, it's the point where a rising trend line on a graph turns completely vertical. So something which is kind of rising like this goes right up sort of as like a vertical line. And for the person who came up with this particular and applied it to world politics, James Bennett, he was writing about the power of the Anglosphere in world politics. His argument is that the Anglosphere is the dominant and should be the dominant bloc in world politics because of its superiorities in various kinds of ways that he argues. And his argument is that for a long time, that Anglosphere was developing in a relatively stable and kind of linear manner. However, the singularity refers to a number of changes and revolutions that occur in society, in politics, economy, and technology, which all come together and coagulate at a particular point. And it's that point at which you have this vertical rise. And that to him is the dominance of the Anglosphere in world politics. And for him, that is the way the world ought to be. For him, that's a positive thing. Now, I would use the term to reverse it and consider it much more in a negative way, not as progress, but as describing reaction, reversal across domains, which represents the deepening of crises and polarizations and factionalizations, a process of greater violence, restrictions and reversals of rights, and the movement towards dictatorship, possibly an elective dictatorship, but full of sham elections as mere opportunities to endorse dominant party candidates. So this, to me, it's a kind of gradual decline of American society, politics, economy, ideology, and so on, and which becomes a cliff off which it falls. The 2016 represents the negative singularity, not a positive singularity. And then we put this in world context, in the crisis of global power shifts and hegemonic instability and transitions with strategic rivalries and systemic rivalries, the war in Ukraine, military tensions and arms races in East Asia regarding Taiwan, as well as the kind of economic tariff wars and decoupling strategies from China that Trump inaugurated, which President Biden has not reversed. Again, this points to great danger. So like organic crisis, the moment of change, that moment of negative singularity does suggest a great deal of tension, rivalry, and great danger domestically as well as globally. The third concept I'd like to sort of introduce, or I'm sure you mostly know it already, polycrisis, which is the liberal buzzword of today. The London Financial Times last year declared 2022 the year of the polycrisis. And the polycrisis effectively refers to the commingling, the gathering together of a series of separate crises, such as COVID-19, climate change, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the attendant food and energy crises in its wake, but also the decline of unipolar power and the unipolar world order, alongside a move to multipolarity, which has multiplied the drivers of crises and led to multitude of crises everywhere all at once. That is to say that the world order has now greater diversity of powers, and that greater diversity of powers has introduced more forces, and there are more drivers, therefore, of global crises than there used to be. So what you've got, in effect, in this view, is multiple subsystems which represent world order. And in those multiple subsystems, there are separate crises which have now causally interconnected with one another and created dangers greater than the sum of their parts. That qualitatively together, they're far more dangerous than they were if they were in isolation. So there is a focus here on subsystems which neglects agency and the unequal distribution of powers and the actors and agencies at its heart. But nevertheless, this polycrisis has become the kind of consensus approach, the technocratic consensus approach in the Bretton Woods system, and among those who manage the Bretton Woods system financially, economically, and in other ways as well. And that includes, if you like, a recognition that there is a crisis of the Western world order, but there needs to be therefore a renegotiation and a renewal to reconstruct that very same order, but under new conditions. That is not a major radical restructuring of power or a significant redistribution of that power, such as to make it a radical change, but certainly one to reconstitute on more legitimate terms, maybe slightly more diversified, but certainly not a multipolar kind of order. But what this polycrisis idea also suggests, there are crises and tensions, rivalries, resentments, contradictions, as well as interpenetrations, that is to say, dangers. Each of these three approaches to understanding how the world works and how the United States works suggests that there is tension and in the transitional moment, that there is likely to be violence and other forms of conflict, possibly dictatorship or authoritarianism as a rising force. The key issue really is, how does the United States see itself in this kind of maelstrom of crises and tensions and so on? Can the United States see itself and survive as one of several world powers? That is to say, will it accept such a status without conflict? So these remain big questions. So I want to now go to the third part of my remarks, which is to do with how did the United States end up where it is today? And I would go back to try to address that, go back to the 1960s, and in effect, the kind of the rollback by corporate power of many of the democratic movements and the gains for society and economic and other conditions society at that time. The rollback of those gains in the 1960s and the kind of diminution of state programs and the kind of embedding of neoliberal order from the 1970s and into the era of Ronald Reagan and the Washington Consensus and so on. That effectively what we get there is a massive growth in the power of the right wing, the new right that is called at that particular time, underpinned by a kind of remobilized, resurgent corporate power and the rise of a right-wing establishment, which could rival the kind of more traditional liberal establishment. So that is the moment where we get, if you like, the origins of many of the elements of the right-wing establishment, which we now see as very well established indeed. That is a religious Christian evangelical establishment, a cultural right-wing establishment, media from the right, intellectuals of the right, think tanks and foundations which underpin and, if you like, organize and contextualize the right itself as well. That is to say, you get the development of a right versus liberal division within the American establishment and ruling elites and so on. But it also underpins a new politics of the two political parties, both underpinned by corporate power, and each of them engaging in a different kind, but nevertheless a kind of identity politics. The Republican Party, an identity politics of white loss, white male breadwinner, heterosexual loss, a loss to minorities and immigrants and others, women. And the Democratic Party more or less coalesced around minority identity politics, around women's rights and so on and so forth, but both underpinned by corporate power. So in effect, what we get then is political competition around culture and race and gender far more than around economic redistribution of income and wealth and so on. And that underpins the neoliberal program inaugurated from the 1970s into the 1980s and which continued apace for many, many decades. And in effect, more and more created the sources of inequality in American society and economy and among the people in income, wealth, and power. And it more and more alienated the American electorate and people from the two main political parties as well. So in effect, what we get then is by the 1990s and the end of the Cold War, the division in the American ruling elites increases because bipartisanship decreases. And then after 9/11 and the global war on terror and the Iraq war and the delegitimization of elites as a result of that, and then the 2008 financial crisis has profound effects on people's lives, but also on American politics. You get the bifurcation of American politics even more between right and the liberal, kind of liberal left. And we see that in the Tea Party, as well as in the Occupy Wall Street movements. And then by 2016, we see that in the rise of the candidacy of Donald Trump, a complete outsider, but an extreme right-wing outsider from American politics, as well as Bernie Sanders from another outsider to the Democratic Party as well on the left. So this sort of long-term movement, if you like, was very critical to the construction of the way in which politics operated. And what I argue is that the presidency of Barack Obama from 2008 onwards played a very powerful role in this bifurcation as well. One was unwitting, that is, first African-American president, but the politics of that particular presidency around the kind of culture wars, that culture of loss of the white male breadwinners' power, the white heterosexual power, and so on. Barack Obama played directly into that and created, if you like, with Donald Trump, recognizing a kind of key moment, a key political moment around the idea of birtherism, challenging Obama's Americanness itself, challenging where he was born, whether he's an authentic American, and then linking that with a kind of broader anxiety about loss and this idea that by 2042 or 2050, the United States would be a majority-minority nation, using white fear and sort of fear of further cultural loss and so on, and mobilizing it, crystallizing it in the political campaigns and using that very well. But unwittingly as well, Barack Obama plays the politics, exercises the policies of big corporate power. So in 2008, and in the wake of the financial crisis, the economic and financial policies and the bailouts were far more dedicated towards corporate bailouts than they were for the lives of ordinary American people, including African Americans. And African Americans were worse off in 2017 than they were in 2007, in the year before Barack Obama became president. That is to say, you have a politics of identity, but policies which are related to corporate power and so on. And he also played a key role in defanging the Occupy Wall Street movement as well. So what we have, if you like, is in the body and the presidency, the leadership of President Barack Obama, a great symbolic kind of movement and reach and achievement, but also many different kind of key factors coming together, which create the conditions for 2016 as well, and for Donald Trump, and therefore of what happened on the 6th of January, 2021. And that still has yet to be resolved. So just my concluding remarks, incredibly complicated, difficult to think about, difficult to know exactly where things are going. So in this context, where would I say the United States is headed? I would argue that it is incredibly confusing, so I'm not going to make any kind of predictions or anything like that. But what I would say is that it is very messy, it's very unstable domestically. There's great danger of political violence on a large scale, particularly from the extreme right. And some of these extreme right-wing, far-right forces are now embedded in the Republican House of Representatives and in the Senate. They're going to be running for the nomination for 2024. And Donald Trump is the leading candidate nationally for the Republican Party for that particular election. But even had Trump been defeated decisively within the Republican Party, we still have the issue of Trumpism without Donald Trump. And we only have to look at Florida with Ron DeSantis as governor to see what a laboratory in the hands of Trumpist, in the hands of someone who is actually competent and politically capable, what that could mean and what that means for shifts to the right in American national politics. But what I would argue is the United States has been in similar positions before. It has faced many, many dangers domestically as well. And that there's also, where there's an iron law of autocracy or oligarchy and things like that, there's also an iron law of democracy. That is to say, despite January the 6th, the US system held together, it survived. There was mass street level mobilizations in various ways. There was mass electoral mobilization. So that although Donald Trump increased his vote in 2020 from 2016 by many millions, there were many more millions galvanized to vote against him in a record number of 81 million votes for Joseph Biden itself. The deep structures of American politics, the courts, the states, and the cities also held firm in not allowing the election results to be in any way tainted by various kinds of pressure from the Trump administration as well. And at the same time, there are, if we look at some of the elements in the American body politic today, particularly in some of the think tanks and foundations, some moves towards what you could call, what they are calling, post-neoliberalism. That is moving beyond market fundamentalism and untrammeled corporate power and untrammeled globalization towards something a lot more manageable, which might then deal and heal some of these ruptures as well. But at the same time, we have a very messy multipolarity internationally with increased risks of conflict and war, a realignment and de-alignment, which is really puzzling and confusing, and we don't know which exactly directions it's going to go in. But one of the greatest tendencies now, which we've seen over the last 12 months in particular, is a kind of bifurcation between states' sources of security and their sources of trade, finance, and investment. That more and more states are refusing to see the world today as in Cold War terms, but saying that we get our security from the United States and other Western powers, but we get our financial, economic, and our commercial positions and our standards of living from China and its allies. And the consequence of that is that there's a greater kind of bifurcation of powers and maybe a degree of kind of realignment or non-alignment, which is developing in the world. This could be a very different kind of world power distribution, which is emerging. But the birth pangs of a new order in the world are often accompanied by war. So that is to say, that danger that these three approaches I talked about, that they all point to, has not gone away. That this could be a moment of reconstruction too, that is Bidenism and so on, but all too frequently, reconstruction is accompanied by what follows massive amounts of destruction. And that is what polycrisis, organic crisis, and negative singularity all point to. But I would finish with something a little bit more optimistic. Antonio Gramsci said many things, but one of the things he also stood for was this idea of pessimism of the intellect, but also optimism of the will. That is to say that we are not powerless in all this maelstrom of everything that is going on, at whatever level or whatever, that there is always hope in mass action and the struggle for peace and for democratic rights. And I would urge you strongly not to be negative, despite the very pessimistic tone of my entire analysis, is that the power does lie in a lot of people's hands and is more diversely distributed now than it ever was. And we see forces at home and abroad, internationally and in domestic political systems, far more diverse, far more assertive in fighting for their lives than we have for many, many decades. And I'd say that is where the future hope may actually lie. So, okay, thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Parmar. I find a contradiction in your speech because you said to us it's hard to talk about how many questions we face today, but we did that so brilliantly and enlightened us with many important issues for us to think here, especially students starting their research now, fifth semester, sixth semester. Pay attention to the topics that were brought here. Thank you very much. It was amazing to hear you. So now I will give the floor to our students to raise questions, if I may. Yes, can we have some minutes for that? So anyone would like to bring an issue? Arthur, please. Yeah, Gabriela, Maria, could you help us, please, with the microphone?
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I have a question because if you think about our liberal order nowadays, I think the main institution we think about United Nations. And if we think about the crisis of this liberal order, how can you think United Nations' role in this poly crisis or this organic crisis?
Anyone else? We'll collect two more questions and then Professor answer them in a block. Oh, okay, here.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the lecture. You said earlier that the U.S. tensions with China are different than the U.S. tensions with the old Soviet Union. But I would like to hear your thoughts on the said inevitable conflict between U.S. and China, and if you believe it's possible that we see violent direct conflict between those two countries.
Thank you, Luca. Can you have one more? Then there are some back there. I think Vito raised the hand first, if I'm not mistaken. It needs to have some minutes.
Professor, first of all, thank you for the lecture. And I would like to ask you, you mentioned, and I certainly agree, that we have an extremely, almost terrifying complex amalgam of relations, trades, and connections around the entire world, which have the US as its leader. Do you think that this is institutional crisis, this domestic institutional crisis in the United States, could currently compromise the entire Western order as we know? Because after all, we are basing its economic and all of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vito. I give the word back to the professor so we can deal with this question.
It's all very interesting, interesting and very big questions. The first question about the role of the United Nations as a kind of a cornerstone of this sort of world order. I guess it's important to sort of see the United Nations is a system and not just in one institution. It is kind of absolutely massive worldwide system with offices everywhere. It has multiple functions, many different agencies and bodies within it. It has a General Assembly and a Security Council. So we see the distribution of power within it is very unequal as well. But nevertheless, the United Nations has kind of changed its role over time as well. It has been used very differently according to different particular historical periods. So in its earliest days, if you like, it was basically a Western dominated organization with mainly Western funding and finance and so on, and therefore very much dominated by them. However, during the 1950s and 1960s, you get a number of developments. You get decolonization. By the 1960s, you got far more global South or third world states, as they were called then, are members of the United Nations as free and sovereign independent countries, and therefore more challenging of the way in which the United Nations itself was able to work, putting issues on the agenda like race in world politics, anti-apartheid, national liberation movements, Israel and Palestine, and so on. And then, of course, later on, the non-aligned movement itself, the bloc of G77, the demands in the 1970s for a new international economic order, which the post-colonial states and the Latin American states combined to try to put forward, if you like, and they use the General Assembly in order to try to do that, as well as the sort of backlash against it at that same time in the United Nations, but also outside of it as well. So what I would say is the United Nations, if you like, it's an empirical question, but in the end, really, it is a question about power. There are some chambers and agencies within the United Nations in which there's greater diversity of voices, and there are some which is real, whether if you're the true military power, violent power of the UN resides, which is the Security Council, which is very unequal. So the United Nations then historically became, to some extent, a reflection of the changes in the world, and many domestic movements, including in the United States, try to make racism, human rights, and so on, international questions in the United Nations as well. So you can kind of use that. So it's a very, very good opportunity, but it's also a system of states, and it's the kind of, if you like, it depends on who are the most powerful states. So I have several former students of mine, agents of mine who work in the United Nations, and they tell me how things work. So for example, if a number of countries or one country says, here's $1 billion, set up this program, the United Nations agencies set up the program and they do those things. If they say aid this group or that group or whatever, and they come up with big money, the United Nations bends in those directions. That is to say, money talks, power talks. So it remains sort of contested, but it is space. And it's better to have that space than to have no space at all. Antonio Gramsci, when Woodrow Wilson visited Italy, Europe in 1919 to discuss the Peace of Paris, he said, here is the greatest Marxist living today, because he put forward the idea of the League of Nations, this international assembly. He wasn't praising Woodrow Wilson as a Marxist. What he was saying was that capitalist internationalism, this is probably the most progressive that capitalist internationalism could ever get in setting up this international body to represent multiple voices. For real change, you need socialist internationalism. So I would say it's a very, very, can be, element of it can be very progressive, but it is in the end made up of multiple states, powerful states. It is generally they who call most of the shots there. In regard to your question about the inevitability of a Sino-US war, I mean, of course, they're the realists in IR, Graham Allison, and many others argue that when you have these transitional moments, hegemonic transitions, that there will be interhegemonic wars. I'm not sure about that, and that's why I think I raised this issue of interpenetration. So when we look at China as it was from the 1950s into the 1970s, up to the death of Mao, if you like, it was a thorn in the side of the United States and of the West. It supported national liberation movements. It gave them money, it gave them arms, it gave them ideological training, it gave them political support, diplomatic support, when no one else would support them. It was anti-colonial and so on. That is, it backed left-wing and other forces against Western colonialism and neo-colonialism, and it supported revolutionary movements as well, especially in Africa, for example, which no one else was supporting. it was outside of the world system, the Western world system, the US liberal order. Look at where it is today. In 2017, January 2017, when Xi went to Davos, when Trump was declaring America first and the globalism as a kind of a threat to the United States and to the West, President Xi said, I will advance the flag of globalization, because China has risen within that particular system, and to some extent as a free rider, actually. So, and the United States, if you like, has played a key role, as did Germany and Britain, and also Hungary and Japan and Canada and other powers as well. In 2021, I think I published a paper about the Ford Foundation and its role in China, and the way in which, if you like, the economics discipline was introduced, Western economics was kind of built and introduced and kind of spread in the Chinese academy, produced PhDs who studied at Chicago and Harvard and elsewhere, and went back and taught economics in Chinese universities and think tanks and so on, which then went up into the policymaking elements as well as think tanks and kind of the more intelligent lay publications as well. That is to say, establishing Western economics as a kind of normal discipline in the Chinese system, you get to see the transformation of that society, the economy, and so on. But it's not an entirely neoliberal market system. It is a socialistic market system with a very powerful role for the Chinese state and therefore of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a kind of state-controlled market system. And I think therein lies the ideological problem for a lot of the Western countries, which are far more neoliberal in their character. But we've seen since the pandemic in particular, more and more statism, more and more kind of government intervention in various areas of Western economic and other lives as well. So I'm not sure that this is a systemic ideological Cold War of two ideologies which are fundamentally at odds with one another. I think these are two sets of interpenetrated elites, economies, and systems which each have a stake in the other. You look at the amount of money that American corporations have made in China and are continuing to make, despite Trumpism, despite the tariff war, despite what Biden goes on and on about. Every survey of the US Chambers of Commerce and any other business lobby in the United States, when they ask them, what do you intend to do in China? They say, invest more, make more money, and make sure that we can get it out. This is despite all the other stuff. So I would argue that there's a great deal of performativity in a lot of the he said, she said, this kind of rhetoric of tension and so on. That is not to say that this is not a problem, because these are two nuclear armed powers which are contending with each other over East Asia. When you look at a map of East Asia and then try to work out the military balance in East Asia, the number one power in East Asia militarily is the United States. The number two power in East Asia is Russia. China's not even the hegemon in its own region. The US has 375,000 military, naval, and air personnel in East Asia, which is more than 50% of its global military forces. China is surrounded by a ring of steel. Nevertheless, that ring of steel is if you like, porous, because goods, services, money, investment, trade continues, despite all the tariffs and so on. So I'm not sure what this is. And that's why I tried to come up with some clever sounding sort of terminology, disarticulated transnational historic bloc with special racial, ideological, and geopolitical features. Well, I didn't think I could remember all that off the top of my head, but I don't know what this is, but it's not, I don't think it's the Cold War, and therefore the inevitability of it. So even during the real Cold War, with all of those differences between the Soviet system and the American and Western systems, there was no nuclear exchange between the great powers. So I would argue that military tension, yes, but a lot of it is, I think, performative. And this is probably where the danger lies, is that the escalations that come from mistakes and misunderstandings and misrepresentations, maybe over Taiwan, could be the trigger for some sort of a conflict. It may not be something wanted, but the brinkmanship which each set of leadership has to play in order to look strong at home and not compromising with their opponents and competitors, could lead to a kind of rising tensions and so on, and therefore could spill over. But I don't believe that the realist theory of inevitable military conflict between these rising and falling hegemons, I'm not sure that it works fully in this particular context. The third question was about whether the crises of US power at home would have knock-on effects on the Western order. They already are. They already have had that effect. So before the 2020 election, there were reports coming from practically every American ally, every Western American ally, fearing that Trump would win in 2020. And Canada especially preparing for the spillover political violence from the United States going into Canada itself. So I would argue that the United States domestic disorders, legitimacy crises, street disorders which are going on, they've already had an effect on practically every power trying to do more to hedge against unreliability of the United States itself. So I think it's already had that effect. Doesn't mean to say that that's a kind of, it's only movement in one direction, because, you know, February 24th, 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. And you will remember 1 year ago or so, for the first few weeks, it looked like Russia had been cancelled, right? Russia was finished. Its funds were frozen. It was sanctioned. It was vilified, diplomatically isolated, and so on and so forth. It was removed from the SWIFT international payment systems, etc. That is, it was the kind of, if you like, the greatest enemy, and it had looked like it was cancelled. However, since then, we've seen that the Ukraine war has created a completely different kind of world politics and political context as well. That, if you like, only 18 or 20 states and entities are actually engaging in sanctions. I mean, in Britain, if you switch on the news, you wouldn't know that there was about 180 other countries which are not applying sanctions. But what we've seen is a realignment and a de-alignment in various kinds of ways. And I think therein lies a big danger for the United States and for the Western order. A large part of what the United States is really good at, or really bad at, is warfare. It wages war after war after war, military intervention, regime change, and so on and so forth. That's why the mass of the American population, the electorate, Republican and Democrat, is opposed to forever wars, permanent wars, endless wars. And both candidates, Trump and Biden, in 2020, in their manifestos, their platforms, for the first time in American history, stood against permanent warfare, right? So what we've got is kind of opposition from the people within the United States to that kind of strategy, as well as opposition from the rest of the world to that sort of a strategy. And to some extent, you know, China's sort of position of so-called peaceful rise, we don't have to buy into the whole China dream, but the fact is that China hasn't waged any wars since 1978. And there's a few skirmishes in the Himalayas and in the Indian border from time to time. But generally speaking, it has, under the shelter of the liberal order, it has come to a very powerful kind of position. So I think, yes, there are sort of sources, but I would argue the United States is also a very resilient system too. It has great strengths and powers of recovery. And so it could well come back from this too. So it's very difficult to know what the future trajectory is. But if Donald Trump were to win in 2024, or somebody like him, then I'll talk to you after that.
Professor, we'll be waiting you here. I hope not because of that. Let's see how the world goes on. Do you mind if you go for 2 more questions? Yeah, I saw some girls raising the hand as well, please. And Bernardo, Bruna, please, after her.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for your lecture. I think by now it's common knowledge that during times of crisis, it's when the most extreme ideas emerge. And I think we've seen that with everything that's happened in the past 3 years, the pandemic and emerging war. And we've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in the US, but it's also been noted in countries that have been known for many years for being very open, very inclusive, but it's a phenomenon that has happened in Sweden with rising neo-Nazi and very far-right parties. Do you think that the change in the power dynamic of the word is also leading us towards a not only economical but political war, with a very strong political bias, such we had in the World War II, with the Nazism and the fascism, and so how do you think that all these is related, and how do you think that this is also related to Trumpism in the US and also Bolsonarism in Brazil?
Thank you. To Bruna, please.
Professor Parmar, thank you very much. My question is more of a provocation, sort of, because it's more of a speculation about the future. But the recent developments in the United States regarding especially the setbacks of human rights, like the repeal of Roe v. Wade and a series of anti-trans legislations that have been approved in Republican states, sort of concern me in the sense of, it seems to me that the United States is creating a gap in the human rights regime. And given that this movement that's happening in the United States, these setbacks are not exclusive to the United States, and we see very similar movements like happening all over the world, especially Western countries. It concerns me, and I wonder if any other country would be interested in filling this gap, if we could expect a world order still under US leadership, where human rights would not be as important, or if there would be a new world order under a different leader or different leaders, where human rights would still matter, or if the US were to not be a leader anymore, other countries would also go towards kind of abandoning the human rights regime. Thank you.
Professor, please.
Great, thank you. Really massive questions, actually. I think you named a number of different countries. Sorry, who was that? Oh, it was you named a number of different countries in which there is a crisis of, if you like, legitimacy and the rise of more extreme and unorthodox political and ideological forces. And it cannot be a coincidence that it's happening more or less at the same time. You could add a whole list of other countries, India, for example, but also the Philippines, Australia, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and so on as well. So there's clearly something systemic in this, and it must be partly to do with the fact that we live in a kind of very globalized order, and that globalized order has had massive systemic effects, which are felt in specific forms and terms within each of the elements of that kind of globalized order. And I think the key thing, of course, is that political forces, ideological forces, are not sort of just spontaneous kind of expressions of mass discontent, but they are also organized in various kinds of ways. They're also sustained in various kinds of ways, and they're funded by particular kinds of forces as well. So it's not like a free market of ideas. We have some problems, so some people become more left-wing and a few people become a bit more right-wing, and that's the way things go because that's how people choose to be. But the fact is that there is a kind of inequality of ideological competition. There is a distorted market of ideas. The bigger money is behind right-wing ideas and not left-wing ideas. So when I, for example, talk about the United States and the rise of, say, the Tea Party, and then how it expresses itself in the rise of Donald Trump later on, we have to look at some really big systemic forces which are also at work. And we often see these as sort of spontaneous political expressions that political entrepreneurs are able to galvanize and mobilize, crystallize behind a campaign. But there are also other actors too. So if you look at the work of, for example, political scientist Theda Skocpol, where she ran a project at Harvard several years ago called Reshaping the American Political Terrain. And there she looked at the power of the Koch brothers, David and the other guy, I can't remember, Charles, and the amount of money that they spent in, if you like, supporting local candidates at so-called grassroots level from the Republican Party to the right of the Republican Party and so on. That is preparing the ground for what became the Tea Party and then later on. That is to say that this crisis of legitimacy is deeply felt by the mass of American people and probably a mass of other societies' people too. The issue is what is to be done about it. If that fundamental system in which these crises of legitimacy have occurred does not change to deal with and help with those fundamental problems of people's lives, and people's lives, just to illustrate it, when people study white America today, and in the last 10 years or more, the most self-destructive elements of the American population are among white men. These are communities of despair, suicide, opioid crisis, drug addiction, crime, police violence, and police killing of white young men is rampant, but they live in rural areas, small towns, not in big media markets, etc. So for a lot of people, there is an objective set of poor social, economic, and psychological conditions. This is mirrored in many other parts of the American sort of body politic as well. So we have this sort of whole basin, a reservoir of crises, but the dominant parties from the 1970s, and that was a point I was trying to make, is they're both underpinned by big corporate money. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party are funded by big corporations, and they fight not on economic redistributions of income, wealth, and power. They fight on culture. They fight on race, ethnicity, on gender, and so on. They don't fight for redistribution of income, wealth, and power. So the big difference, if you like, in 2020 was from Biden, and which is where I say there is something going on, which is kind of trying to reimagine, is that he used this term called bipartisan, grassroots bipartisanship. His argument was that the American people as a whole pretty much are not doing very well. And they don't care about the two political parties so much as the conditions in which they live. And we need to go above the party heads and down to where the people actually live to try to sort of detach it from this polarization of the parties. But unfortunately, his own party is embroiled in that very polarization because of the character of its funding sources. So repression then becomes the principal weapon against the mass discontent and the mass protest that occurs. So that is where we are. This is where the repression comes from. It's coming from the state and state forces. Democratic, so wherever there's a Democratic governor, Democratic mayor, and so on, it's the same policy, that police strategies which emerge. So that does make it a very pessimistic kind of analysis, but we saw something very transformational in the wake of the George Floyd police killing. We saw even Republican voters, 55% of them saying police racist violence is a problem of the United States. Racism is too deeply entrenched in the United States. That is to say, a few months of massive protest from below created a massive shift in public opinion. But the political parties have reversed that in effect. And Biden, which he was very critical of the police and so on at that time to ride the wave, is now back, and he's not defunded the police, he's refunding the police and rearming the police all over. They don't have a full and proper solution to that problem. And I would argue that the same phenomena in slightly different terms is probably operational in some of the other countries that you mentioned as well. So that makes it a very dangerous kind of time, but it also makes it something which says that mass agency, ordinary people's agency, students, people whose lives are affected and who have to fight for their lives, they got to fight for their lives. They got to stand up, and that shifts elite power in different directions. And I think that's the only way that is going to happen. That's the only reliable ally against the far right. We've seen, I mean, in a couple of months ago in Brazil, that what looked horribly like January 6, 2021 in the United States, but possibly worse because they were calling for a military coup to follow what they were doing. These kind of forces are allowed to pretty much go free. Nobody from the Trump camp and his allies in the Republican Party has been charged with the most serious offenses that they committed. They're more bold now than they were before. And they are now inside the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And they're doing very well in the polls within the Republican Party and so on. Those forces are still very powerful, and they will need to be opposed. But the only saving thing is there's mass action, but also people mobilize electorally as well. And I think the Democratic Party is playing a very dangerous game in this regard. I think they would prefer Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee in 2024, because he does a job for them which is better than the job they can do for themselves. He scares a lot of people and therefore drives them into the arms of the Democratic Party, much more than anything positive coming out of the Democratic Party itself. And I think that sort of deals with some of the questions you talked about. I mean, one thing I would say about the so-called human rights regime that the United States has been championing, allegedly, for such a long time, you just have to look at, I mean, the US-led order, if we date it to around 1945, they were violating the very rules of their own system from the very beginning, in Palestine, in Indonesia, then in Korea, then in Vietnam, and many, many other places as well. I would defy you to talk about moral leadership and human rights after Guantanamo and Bagram and the torture memos and the renditions, kidnappings, then the drone targeted assassination programs, and so on and so forth. That is to say, I think there was a human rights regime. It did not operate all the time. It operated more for their friends than it did for human rights as a whole. And then you've got another power like China, for example, saying, we don't care about your domestic regime. We don't care about the kind of state that you have. If you want a bridge, a port, an airport, a railway, we'll build it for you. No conditions. They're getting a lot of soft power as a result of their hard economic power, and they're winning more and more allies. That doesn't mean to say it's a one-way street. I think countries in the world are much more wise to, they have choice. There's more diversity of powerful states regionally and globally, and they have choice. And I think a sort of non-aligned movement 2.0 or something is in the offing, and perhaps the sham of human rights has been exposed as such. Large number of countries which were in the kind of broadly Western Washington consensus, they didn't really see a great deal of so-called human rights in the economic and social conditions under which their people lived. And the pandemic showed up very clearly the global inequalities of whose lives really matter more. When you got all the main pharmaceutical companies in the West, and then controlling the patents, preventing those from being used and licensed in the third world, in the global South, and so on. I think you have to challenge very fundamentally the idea of human rights as something which is authentic when it came to living and dying. So I think it exposed all the inequalities of that order, and I think people have lost faith in that kind of an order as well. And they have more options nowadays. Their own countries' economies are more powerful than they used to be. They have a renewed sense of self-confidence in world politics too, as well as more economic opportunities, etc. So I would say that's what makes the world much more complicated and probably more unpredictable than it used to be. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I have seen some hands raised, but we're still, we are already, I'm sorry, very late. So I would save those questions for a future meeting that I hope will be happening soon. You'll be always welcome to this house, right, Professor Tanya? So we expect to receive you again in a near future. And I thank you very much. I'd like to finish the day here saying that I have this thought that I perceive our classrooms are always more fulfilled with students when the world gets worse. I don't know if you have the same feeling in Great Britain. For example, this semester we have 54 new students, new fresh students. They are where they are, please raise the hands, the fresh students. On one hand, it worries me because it's a sign that we have so many crises to deal with. On the other hand, it gives me a material proof of the optimism Gramish said in the beginning of the century, because I see all those young men and women interested in changing the world and make the world a better place to live. So I encourage you to keep with this feeling for the rest of your graduation here. And thank you very much for the attention. Thank you.